In this episode, we start with a very practical question that sits in the mind of almost every new learner, which is how to prepare well enough to pass on the first try without turning the process into chaos. That goal sounds simple, but it usually becomes difficult when people study in a scattered way, jump between too many resources, or confuse anxiety with productivity. Certified in Risk and Information Systems Control, CRISC, rewards a specific kind of preparation, and the sooner you understand that, the better your odds become. This is not an exam where brute force memorization alone usually carries the day, because the questions are trying to measure whether you can think like a professional who understands governance, risk, controls, accountability, and business alignment. A first attempt pass is much more likely when your study process is built around judgment, consistency, and review habits that actually improve understanding. That means the most useful strategies are not flashy shortcuts or dramatic tricks. They are disciplined methods that help you absorb concepts, recognize patterns in questions, and stay calm enough to choose the best answer instead of the most tempting one. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. One of the strongest strategies is to begin with the right mental model of what success actually looks like. Many beginners assume passing means becoming an expert in every possible topic that might touch risk or security, and that belief creates stress before real studying even begins. A better starting point is understanding that the exam is looking for sound professional judgment across the defined body of knowledge, not perfection across all of cybersecurity. That difference matters because it shapes the way you study. Instead of chasing every possible detail, you focus on learning how risk concepts connect, how governance influences decision-making, how controls support business objectives, and how response and monitoring fit into the larger picture. This makes preparation more manageable and more strategic. When learners tell themselves they must know everything, they often panic and overconsume material without learning it deeply. When they tell themselves they must think clearly and consistently within the exam's framework, they study with more purpose. Passing on the first attempt usually begins with that shift, because it turns preparation from a fight against endless content into a structured effort to master the right perspective. Another proven strategy is to build your study plan around consistency rather than intensity. A lot of people imagine that success comes from occasional marathon study sessions where they try to absorb huge amounts of material in a single sitting. That approach feels serious, but it often produces fatigue, poor retention, and a false sense of progress. CRISC preparation usually works better when the learner studies on a regular schedule that is realistic enough to survive normal life. Shorter, repeated sessions often beat heroic bursts because the brain learns more effectively through steady reinforcement than through exhaustion. Consistency also makes it easier to notice whether your understanding is improving over time. When you return to the material often, concepts begin to connect more naturally, and your confidence becomes based on recognition and reasoning rather than hope. This matters especially for first-attempt success because the exam is not just about what you can remember after one good weekend of study. It is about whether you have developed a stable understanding that stays available under pressure. A realistic plan protects that understanding and reduces the chance that your preparation will collapse when work, family, or stress inevitably interfere. A third strategy is to study the domains in a way that shows their relationships instead of treating them like isolated boxes. Beginners sometimes review one area at a time and never pause to notice how governance, risk assessment, response, and monitoring depend on one another. That creates a fragile kind of learning because exam questions often draw on the logic that connects these areas. Governance influences ownership and accountability. Ownership affects how risks are identified and evaluated. Risk assessment informs response decisions. Response decisions matter only if controls and monitoring show whether exposure is changing over time. When you study with those links in mind, the material becomes easier to understand and much easier to remember. This also helps with first-attempt performance because it reduces the feeling that every question is brand new. Instead, you begin to recognize a familiar pattern underneath the wording. A question may appear to focus on one decision, but the correct answer often depends on understanding where that decision sits inside the broader life cycle of risk management. Learners who see those relationships clearly are usually less likely to be fooled by answer choices that sound right in isolation, but break the logic of the larger process. It is also proven helpful to focus on concept mastery before heavy question drilling. Many learners rush into large banks of practice questions because they want proof that they are making progress. But if they have not yet built a clear understanding of the concepts, the questions become little more than repeated guessing. That can actually slow growth, because the learner starts memorizing answer patterns without truly understanding why the correct option is correct. Concept mastery means being able to explain a topic in plain language, connect it to business purpose, and recognize how it affects decision-making. If you cannot describe the idea clearly, there is a good chance you are not ready to test yourself on it in a useful way. Once concepts are more stable, practice questions become much more valuable because they teach refinement rather than basic discovery. This is an important difference for first attempt success. You do not want the exam to be the first time your understanding is asked to perform under pressure. You want practice to reveal small weaknesses in an already meaningful foundation. That way, each question improves your judgment instead of merely exposing confusion you should have addressed earlier. Active recall is another strategy that consistently helps serious learners perform better. Active recall means forcing yourself to bring information back from memory rather than simply rereading or listening again and again. This sounds simple, but it is one of the most effective ways to test whether knowledge is really becoming usable. A learner who only rereads notes may feel familiar with the material, but familiarity is not the same as recall. On exam day, the question will not ask whether a term looks recognizable. It will ask whether you can identify the meaning, the context, the relationship, and the best decision. Active recall can be as simple as closing your notes and explaining a concept out loud in your own words, or pausing after a study session and summarizing what you just learned without looking at the source. The reason this strategy is so useful for first attempt success is that it reveals weakness early. If you cannot retrieve the idea, then rereading alone will not solve the problem. You need more engagement, more comparison, and more thinking. Learners who use active recall regularly tend to build stronger memory and better confidence because they know their understanding has been tested, not just exposed to the page. Closely related to that is the strategy of reviewing mistakes more carefully than correct answers. Many students look at a practice score, feel relief if it seems decent, and move on too quickly. That wastes one of the best learning opportunities in the entire study process. An incorrect answer is often more valuable than a correct one because it shows exactly where your thinking broke down. Maybe you chose the most technical option instead of the most governance-aligned one. Maybe you picked the strongest control without considering business context. Maybe you answered too quickly and missed a clue about ownership, timing, or risk treatment. When you study those mistakes properly, you begin to see your own habits of misreading and overthinking. That self-awareness is extremely useful for passing on the first attempt because many candidates do not fail from lack of effort. They fail because they repeat the same reasoning errors over and over without noticing the pattern. Reviewing wrong answers with patience teaches you how the exam is trying to think. It also helps you become less emotional about mistakes, which matters because fear can make learners avoid the very feedback that would help them improve the fastest. A particularly important strategy for CRISC is learning to think from the perspective of disciplined professional judgment rather than reactive technical urgency. New learners sometimes believe the best answer must be the one that sounds the most protective, the most aggressive, or the most immediate. In real organizations, though, the best answer often reflects order, governance, accountability, and business alignment rather than pure intensity. That means first attempt success depends partly on training yourself to slow down and ask what the organization needs most in this situation. Does the problem require clearer ownership before action can be trusted? Does a decision require assessment before response? Does leadership need risk information in a form that supports business judgment? Does monitoring matter because a control already exists and now the question is whether it is working? This kind of reasoning becomes easier with practice, but it must be practiced intentionally. A learner who always chases the most dramatic answer may perform well in technical conversations and still struggle on this exam. A learner who recognizes that mature risk management often values structure before urgency is much more likely to choose the option that the exam considers best. Time management during preparation is also one of the strategies that separates successful candidates from overwhelmed ones. It is very easy to lose time on low-value activity, especially when the material feels broad and the learner wants to feel busy. Some spend too long perfecting familiar topics because it feels comfortable. Others constantly switch resources because novelty creates the illusion of progress. Stronger candidates usually protect their time by returning again and again to what actually improves performance. They identify weak areas, review them until the confusion decreases, and keep a rough balance between learning new material and reinforcing old material. They also avoid waiting for the perfect study mood. That matters because first attempt success usually comes from accumulation, not inspiration. A study hour used consistently is often more valuable than a brilliant plan that never becomes a habit. Good time management also means leaving enough room for review near the end rather than studying new concepts at full speed right up to the finish line. The goal is not just exposure to everything once. The goal is enough repetition and reflection that the ideas remain organized in your mind when the exam demands calm reasoning under timed conditions. Another proven strategy is to build stamina along with knowledge. Some learners prepare as if content is the only challenge, but an exam also tests concentration, patience, and emotional steadiness over time. A candidate may know the material well and still underperform if mental fatigue causes careless reading, rushed decisions, or frustration halfway through. That is why part of good preparation involves practicing sustained attention. You do not need to turn every study session into a test simulation, but you do need occasional periods where you work through questions or review concepts for long enough to feel what mental drift is like and learn how to manage it. This helps because fatigue creates predictable problems. People start reading only the first half of a question, they begin choosing the first plausible answer, or they stop noticing words that signal priority and sequence. Building stamina reduces those risks. It also makes exam day feel less foreign, which lowers anxiety. Passing on the first attempt is not only about knowing enough. It is also about maintaining the quality of your reasoning long enough for your knowledge to actually show up in your choices. A first attempt pass is also more likely when you develop a habit of translating formal concepts into plain language. One reason learners struggle with exams like this is that the terminology can begin to feel heavier than the ideas really are. When that happens, students memorize phrases without understanding what they mean in normal organizational life. The better strategy is to keep converting concepts into everyday professional language. If you are studying governance, explain it to yourself as how the organization sets direction, expectations, and accountability. If you are studying risk response, restate it as how the organization chooses what to do about exposure it understands. If you are studying monitoring, describe it as how the organization checks whether the chosen approach is working. This kind of translation makes the material far more durable because it attaches meaning to the terms. It also improves question performance because the exam is really asking whether you understand the idea, not whether you can admire the wording. Learners who do this consistently often sound less formal when they study, but they perform more effectively because they are reasoning from understanding instead of reciting from memory. One more strategy that repeatedly proves useful is learning how to eliminate answer choices for clear reasons instead of staring at all options as if they are equally possible. Many questions become less intimidating when you stop asking which answer feels best and start asking which answers violate the exam's logic. An option may be too technical for the scenario, too reactive, too early in the process, too weak on ownership, or too disconnected from business alignment. When you can spot those problems, the question becomes more manageable even if you are not immediately certain of the final choice. This is especially helpful under pressure because uncertainty often makes learners freeze or chase wording tricks that are not actually central. Elimination restores structure to your thinking. It turns the question back into a judgment exercise instead of a guessing contest. For first attempt success, this matters because there will almost certainly be moments when you do not feel fully confident. A disciplined elimination approach lets you keep moving intelligently. It is often the difference between a reasonable decision and a panicked one, and that can matter a great deal across a full exam. Emotional control is another strategy that deserves more respect than it usually gets. Some learners study seriously and still damage their own performance by constantly measuring themselves against fear. A low practice score becomes proof they are failing. A hard topic becomes proof they are not cut out for the exam. A difficult question becomes proof the real exam will be impossible. This way of thinking drains energy and leads to unstable preparation. The stronger approach is to treat feedback as information, not identity. A weak score means a skill or concept needs more work. Confusion means a topic needs clearer explanation or more repetition. Mental fatigue means your study rhythm may need adjustment. None of these things, by themselves, predict failure. In fact, most learners who eventually pass have periods of doubt and inconsistency somewhere along the way. What matters is whether they keep converting that experience into better preparation. Emotional control helps on exam day as well. If a candidate meets a hard question and immediately spirals into panic, the damage spreads. If the candidate stays calm, uses elimination, and keeps reasoning, one hard moment stays only one hard moment. It is also wise to protect your preparation from resource overload. A beginner can easily collect so many books, notes, videos, summaries, and question banks that study becomes a constant act of switching. That creates mental fragmentation because each resource may frame the material slightly differently, use different emphasis, or introduce unnecessary detail. The problem is not that multiple resources are always bad. The problem is that too many resources can prevent depth. A first attempt pass is usually supported by repeated engagement with a manageable set of materials that align well with the exam's way of thinking. Repetition across a few strong sources often builds more understanding than shallow exposure across 10 different ones. This is especially true late in preparation, when confidence often comes less from discovering something new and more from confirming that the major concepts are now stable. Learners sometimes worry that using fewer resources means they are missing something important. In reality, they are often protecting the coherence of their preparation. Understanding grows when the mind has enough continuity to connect ideas instead of constantly resetting to new language and new presentation styles. By the time you reach the final stretch of preparation, the best strategy is usually to trust the structure you have built and focus on clarity rather than cramming. At that stage, you want to reinforce the core relationships, keep practicing thoughtful question analysis, and maintain confidence through familiarity with the material instead of last-minute panic. A first attempt pass rarely comes from one dramatic breakthrough near the end. It usually comes from many smaller decisions made well over time, including choosing consistency over chaos, concept mastery over shallow memorization, review over denial, and calm reasoning over emotional reaction. That is the real meaning behind proven strategies. They are not secrets. They are habits that line up with how CRISC is designed and how adults actually learn under pressure. If you build your preparation around those habits, you give yourself a very real chance to succeed the first time. Even more importantly, you come away with a stronger understanding of risk and control thinking that will matter beyond the exam itself, which is exactly the kind of preparation worth having.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.